Hello everyone, my name is Lee Constable and welcome to another session that we're calling What the Cop. At the moment the question is, what the cop did you miss out on today? And the answer is a lot. So these are a few different recaps I'm doing. Yesterday I recapped day one of the Better Futures Forum and today is a recap for day two. Before we get into recapping, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am broadcasting to you from. I am here on the land of the Turrbal and Yugara people, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge the ongoing relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations people from the over 250 First Nations that make up what we now call Australia have with land, sea and sky. So before we get into the ins and outs of today's sessions at the Better Futures Forum, I just wanted to give everyone a little intro to what Better Futures Forum is all about. And to do that, I've got a video here featuring Dan Illich, who's the MC of Better Futures Forum, and also he's an investigative humorist, he puts it. He is a comedian and satirist who does a lot of broadcasting and satirical comedy around latest topics, current affairs, and definitely, especially climate through his podcast, Irrational Fear. So let's kick things off by adding that to the stream now.
The virtual Better Futures Forum will bring together Australians from all walks of life who are accelerating the transition to a better, healthier and more prosperous zero emissions future.
Our desire is to put our country back together again on the right path, on a path that makes sure that all Australians can enjoy the benefits of this country into the next 10 generations ahead of us.
I think we have this impetus here for change. This is the moment. We need to grab it. We can work together. We can be creative. This isn't about losing jobs. This is actually about creating a new world that's better for all of us.
We need Australia to have a clear roadmap to how we're going to get to net zero by 2050. That's why we're joining with other climate leaders at the Better Futures Forum in August.
Cities are a really important partner in this race. We can help to turbocharge emission reductions in Australia, but we need to work together and we need the national government's support.
We have the opportunity to be the renewables powerhouse of the world, as Ross Garnaut says, a superpower of renewable energy. And we have the opportunity to accelerate a just transition between city and country.
This is a moment that all of us can own to prove that Australians are ready for zero emissions futures.
The business case has never been clearer. That's why we are participating in the Better Futures Forum, so we can all come together and ensure that Australia doesn't get left behind.
I want the whole community to benefit from this transition so no one is left behind and no one is left out. This is entirely possible in Australia. We just need the imagination and the desire to do this from all sectors of community, including our government.
So health, agriculture, business, local government, state and federal government, everybody, community members. None of us are excluded from this. We all have a role to play.
Add your voice to this incredibly important issue around climate justice.
The virtual Better Futures Forum from the 17th to the 19th of August 2021. 70 plus leaders, 3 days, one shared goal. Go to betterfutures.org.au/forum.
So there you go. That was a great intro for anyone who hasn't heard about Better Futures Australia or indeed the Better Futures Forum. So we are halfway through or over halfway through the 3-day forum now. We have had a jam-packed program, just as we saw yesterday. If you were able to join the recap then, it was even more jam-packed today, not least because we had 3 different sessions, breakout sessions with 4 to 5 different simultaneous discussions happening, and I am just so glad that those of us who are at this forum get to watch these discussions back after the fact, because if I had to choose one and only one, and I even found that difficult on the spot to do, knowing that. So let's have a look at the program. I've got the program up. And I'm going to go through the day bit by bit to tell you at least some of what you missed out on. There was a lot. So one thing that we have had each day is we've had, yesterday we had a welcome to country from Uncle Ray Minicon. Today was an acknowledgement of country from Dr. Virginia Marshall. And we were able to hear her do an acknowledgement of country in language. So for those of you who don't know of Dr. Virginia Marshall, there's a lot to say about her, and her involvement in Better Futures has been in talking about First Nations people involvement in climate action and climate justice. She is the executive member of the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia. She's at the ANU, Australian National University Climate Change Institute. She's a Wiradjuri Nyamba educator, and she's also a legal academic and practicing lawyer. So it was great to have Dr. Virginia Marshall doing the acknowledgement of country at the top of the day. So one thing that today's theme was all about was short-term actions and opportunities. So we hear a lot, unfortunately, we're hearing a lot of 2050 targets talked about. And it's good, it's fine to have a 2050 target, but more and more what's being brought home in these forums where we're talking about climate action and the road to COP, what the COP, Conference of Parties, the international climate negotiations and talks that happen every year that we're heading towards. We hear that we need long-term, but we also need short-term goals. We need short-term goals so that we have immediate actions, so that we're not just kicking the can down the road, and definitely because it can't wait. What we saw was a lot more discussions from different sectors. If you joined the recap yesterday, you would have seen there were some sessions that were about health. There were definitely a lot of sessions today which were about the health sector's role, which was great to see. We had breakout sessions which were on topics. I'm just going to read through these topic headings right now, and then I'll go into some messages that you can take away from each of them. We had a better transport future, local governments in the transport revolution, justice in the community on the path to zero emissions, creating a zero emissions healthcare sector for Australia, and partnering to achieve zero emissions supply chains. So big topics, lots to talk about, as you can imagine. But one thing is that, like I said, at least we can go back and watch what we missed out on. Lucky for me, I was able to dip in and out of different sessions and take notes along the way, but luckily there were others also taking notes, so I've got some takeaways from those sessions. Starting with the local government transport revolution and looking at better futures for transport. That's obviously a massive topic. Australia is actually very far behind the rest of the world when it comes to electric vehicle uptake. The cool thing is that there's so much great technology out there, and it's becoming more and more accessible to make electric vehicles your next vehicle for a lot more people. So obviously there's still a long way to go on that when it comes to affordability and infrastructure, charging stations and things like that. Lots of things to talk about when it comes to what that looks like And not just personal transport, but buses and public transport systems came up as well. And of course, the topic of alternate transport, the zero and low emissions transport, like walking and riding bikes and things like that. So some key takeaways from that session, we had, just to go through the speakers at that session, there was Alexi Lynch, who's business manager at Ironbark Sustainability, Rob Law, who's executive officer of Central Victorian Greenhouse Alliance, Petra Stock, who's a campaigner at the Australian Conservation Foundation, Claire Painter, head of business development at Jet Charge, and Alice Woodruff, who's director of Active City. So the key opportunities that came out of that discussion when it comes to a path to zero. Some of them were COVID-19 provides a chance to reset our approach to transport, acknowledging that a lot of people's mobility has been a lot lower than before, and we've come up with lots of tech solutions like having more virtual conferences like the one we've been having. Transport is the fastest growing sector of emissions growth in Australia. I was surprised to hear that, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one. Then again, I was in a virtual room full of people who knew a lot about this topic. And Australia's a real laggard when it comes to global transport revolution, as I mentioned. Transport planning now needs to fit in with net zero targets. That was acknowledged all round. We need a zero emissions transport strategy. So walking and cycling and active transport obviously is part of that, but we also need to look at a shift away from aviation, reducing our reliance on flying, especially short distances, especially when there are virtual ways to access things like meetings, and suggested ways to work together with collective leadership. We need a zero emissions transport strategy that involves us all, and that can be very localized. Obviously, different cities and towns and areas, regional areas, remote areas, of course, there are very different transport requirements and needs of the communities in those different areas. So local governments are really important in this. That was something that came up, and shifting support for infrastructure away from cars into active transport when it comes to those more metropolitan areas. We use $7 billion per year. Use $7 billion per year fuel tax rebate for the transport revolution was one of the things suggested. So that's a lot already when it comes to that session. Yesterday, I managed to wrap the day into an hour. I think this recap will be a little bit longer. So I've just got on the screen a little slideshow of different screenshots from today and the different chats that we had today. So after I go through this first breakout session, we'll see another great video from Better Futures Australia, and then I'll go into the second. We'll see another video, and then I'll go into the third, just so you know what to expect. Also, I meant to say, feel free to shout out and say hello in the chat. I'm actually not only streaming here on the Better Futures Australia LinkedIn page. Hello, if you're on the LinkedIn page. I'm also streaming on my Twitch page, my public Facebook page, and my YouTube channel as well. So if you're on the Constababble or Lee Constable social media, say hi. It's great to have you here. And I'm really enjoying the fact that technology can bring us into these amazing virtual realms of virtual conference chats, but that I can also simulcast out to you. How cool is that? So hi. I am going cross-eyed, keeping my eyes across all of the various comment areas for comment in chats and things like that, but I will try to keep my eye on that. If you have a specific question or just want to say hi, go ahead. So one thing that I now wanted to look at was the healthcare emissions. I'll go first to justice in the community and then the healthcare emissions before we go into the other first breakout session chats. So creating zero emissions healthcare sector. Justice in the community on the path to zero, I should talk about first. Justice in the community can mean many things to many people, but when it came to justice in the community in this chat, we were really talking about equity and making sure that people aren't left behind, either because they work in industries that are being and will be phased out, such as the fossil fuel sector and mining, in some of the mining industries, I should say. There are going to be some mining industries that obviously will boom because of the move to renewables. So we're looking at those different sectors, as well as people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, for instance, migrants, people who have English not as their first language, people who work in unstable work, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are many different people who already experience inequity in our community that is exacerbated by climate change, and we don't want climate action to further exacerbate that and leave people behind. So we heard from Dr. Amanda Cahill, who's the CEO of The Next Economy, Mark Wakeham, who's Senior Advisor at the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Professor Catherine Bowen, who's Deputy Director of Melbourne Climate Futures. She's also an IPCC lead author, on the 6th assessment report, which was the huge IPCC report that came out just last week. And shout out to the people on my Twitch who have been bearing with me while I live read the policymakers summary of that report on Twitch over the last few days. I'll still be doing a few more streams because it's a lot to get through. And we also heard from Kelly Court, who's the Senior Advisor in Climate and Energy at ACOS. So Australian, ACOS. What do you stand for? It's social services. Looking at social equity. I should look that up actually, rather than just reading the acronym out. So we had Australian Council of Social Services. There you go. That's what ACOS stands for. So we had quite a breadth of different perspectives on justice in the community. So here are some of the takeaways. As I mentioned, there's the impact of climate change on marginalised, disadvantaged communities, poorer income families. All those different communities that I mentioned already are on the forefront and are more likely to be impacted negatively by the effects of climate crisis, either the effects when it comes to natural disaster or the effects on economy, on their economy. But beyond that, we're also seeing that those that are set to profit the most, to gain the most advantage when it comes to the opportunities that climate action poses, that is actually an unequal playing field as well, and can actually exacerbate some of these issues. So those are the broad themes of what it means when we talk about why we're not all experiencing the same impacts from climate change. So we need to go beyond protecting communities into benefiting them to unlock ambition. We need transformative change was another thing that came up. So build safer and more inclusive future. We need to work's needed across the economy. So we need to look at the policies that we're making, that they're not just reducing emissions, but that if there are subsidies, if there are profits from this transition, that they are equitably doled out, I guess, to different classes, as well as the fact that we don't want to see things like climate policies that only benefit middle and upper class people. So work's required across the board when it comes to those things. And of course, Mark Wakeham, in his role with trade unions, was talking about not only the industries like fossil fuel industries having to transition and what that means for workers, but also communities, the broader communities that rely on that economy. So one example of tackling climate change and how that has significant repercussions through economy that was given was mandating energy efficiency standard for rental properties and putting solar in public housing and low-income homeowners. So an example where renters have the least ability to do things to their property to not only mitigate climate change, but to adapt to actually have your property well insulated and ready to deal with natural disasters like, for instance, heat waves. So actually mandating landlords to do those sorts of things was a really important thing that came up. And we talked as well about working within communities, not talking about what this sector or that sector should or could do, but actually talking with these sectors. And definitely there was a lot of similar discussion in other sessions throughout the day. When it comes to zero emissions and the health sector, there were several different breakout sessions throughout the day that were on health, including the impact of climate change on health, but also we were looking more today at how the healthcare sector can actually be part of this change and actually create a zero emissions healthcare sector in the way that they practice. And I think it was great to see also then there was another breakout session, which was healthcare workers as part of the climate solution that built on that discussion. So that was featuring, we heard from speakers from, for instance, the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation, Medical Pantry, which actually Dr. Nguyen tries to get medical supplies to where they're needed most so they don't go to waste. We heard from Dr. Kate Charlesworth from Sydney North Health Network. We heard from Professor Alexandra Barrett, who's the lead investigator at Wiser Healthcare at University of Sydney in that as well. And we also had, all these discussions about health that really built on each other from yesterday to today. So it was great to see such a strong, I guess, contingent from the healthcare sector. In the creating zero emissions healthcare sector talk in the morning, we had Dr. Jason Wu from the George Institute for Global Health, Peter Thomas from the Association for Medical Research Institutes, Janine Mohammed, or Dr. Janine Mohammed, I should say, who's the CEO of Lawicha Institute, Sally Mangan, who's Director of Sustainability at Ambulance Victoria, and Josh Carliner, International Director of Program and Strategy at Healthcare Without Harm. And we also heard from Dr. Eugenie Kayak, who's a spokesperson for Doctors for the Environment. So all of these different people came together to talk about, for instance, that we have to think about equity in our healthcare system as we're thinking about how we're going to move to zero emissions. For instance, Dr. Janine Mohammed talked about the importance of keeping First Nations health care at the forefront of our minds as we go through these transitions to make sure that communities aren't further alienated from the healthcare system and that we are able to reduce emissions whilst not reducing quality of care. So that's something from those two sessions that we saw as a theme that came up again and again. When it comes to partnering to achieve zero emission supply chains, we heard from Ryan Swenson, who's the head of Sustainable Development and Office Works, Jarrah Bassel, who's Sustainability Manager at Transurban, Monica Richter, who's Senior Manager of Low Carbon Communities at WWF, Ian McConnell, who's Director of Beef Sustainability at Tyson Foods, and Fred Anderson, who's the Corporations and Supply Chains Lead at Carbon Disclosure Project. So it was great to see, following on from yesterday, you might have heard the bit of a recap I did on Scope 3 emissions and the important part that they played in one of our breakout sessions. We also saw that there was this deeper discussion on supply chains, furthering that discussion. So it was great to see things building on each other when it comes to starting to make these short-term goals. One, talking about supply chains, we heard from, for example, Ian McConnell. He was talking about meat processing and achieving net positive influence by 2030, which is a good short-term goal. We want to hear more 2030 numbers from our leaders, not just our corporates and community leaders, but our government leaders, our politicians as well. And providing a life worth living for the animal in their supply chains is something else that he spoke about. So when it came to making a plan, there was talk around working together for 2030 to achieve net zero emissions in all 3 scopes, which is ambitious, and we like to see ambition. The industry has already seen 57% reduction in carbon footprints. So companies think about their carbon budget and set medium to long-term targets. There's a mission portfolio of the meat processing factory in southeast Queensland at stage 3 emissions. So there's a need for partnership and collective action to scale the unprecedented supply chain. So there was really a talk about needing to work with everyone in the space, up and down the supply chain, no matter what sector you work in, to make sure that we're not just ignoring things that are up and downstream, that we can actually use our up and downstream emissions as a way of having an opportunity for looking more broadly and greater corporate responsibility, but also, as someone mentioned yesterday, greater risk assessment when we're moving into this world that is concerned with carbon more than ever before, and other emissions, I should say. So that was a huge session, and as you can see, you can probably see why I'm blown away with the idea of recapping each day. I'm like, I put my hand up and said I wanted to do this, and now I'm like, how am I going to recap? Everyone is already, I feel, summarizing a wealth of knowledge into these short sessions for us all to enjoy, and then I'm further trying to distill that down into a recap. But worthwhile, I think, always, because we can't be in all places at once. And it's important to think about how we can reach more people with these messages, and also get more people involved who might want to be involved with Better Futures Australia and other efforts out there to bring together people from different sectors. So if you are watching and you're wondering where to go, you can go to betterfutures.org.au to check out how you can get involved. Maybe you want to see if your sector, maybe you're an Australian and you want to see if your sectors are represented. So I will now go to a video, another one from Better Futures Australia, and then I'll come back and do some more recapping of our next breakout sessions. Thanks so much, everyone, popping a hello in the chat. Again, my name is Lee Constable, hosting these as part of a series called What the COP, where I'm trying to figure out what on earth to do in the lead up to these big things like COP26, the international negotiations, the big IPCC reports, all those things that make you feel a little bit small, and doing things like being involved in forums where I hear about concrete ways that myself and other people in their professions, in their daily lives can be part of a bigger change is definitely helping me. So without further ado, as they like to say, why not, since we've been talking about the health sector, we'll go to a video about just that.
Australia needs to act on climate change because our population is really feeling the impacts of climate change. In Western Sydney, where I work, the temperatures have hit close to 50 degrees. The impact on my patient population has been devastating. If we actually don't do anything about adaptation or mitigation, Western Sydney will not be livable. As a doctor working on individual patients, I could see that it was impossible for me to actually help my patients. So I tell patients, you know, what you eat, what you drink, how you live, how much you exercise determines how healthy you are. When I could see that the heat and the air pollution was beyond my control, that it's a systems problem that requires a system solution. Our health is inextricably linked to our environment. We need clean air, clean water, healthy soils, a stable climate and a healthy ecosystem for us to be healthy. Climate change is impacting our population now and is the greatest threat to our public health. We know this. We know the benefits of transition are enormous for the health of our community. A better future for Australia is for Australia to use its abundant renewable energy. We have enough wind and sunlight here to power the whole of Australia, and the technology for storage is rapidly improving. The possibilities are infinite. We want to lead in this race to have a healthy future. I want the whole community to benefit from this transition so no one is left behind and no one is left out. This is entirely possible in Australia. We just need the imagination and the desire to do this from all sectors of community, including our government.
There you go. So all we need is our imagination. I think imagining a better world, it's becoming clearer and clearer to a lot of people what that looks like. And so that was just one example of a healthcare worker, a professional in medicine and healthcare who is concerned about the climate and also not leaving anyone behind. And that was a definite theme throughout that video. So if you've just joined, hi, I'm Lee Constable and I am recapping What the Cop You Missed Today, which is where basically I'm talking about the Better Futures Forum, which is what I've got this little program up here for. Better Futures Australia is all about bringing people together who are leaders and members of different communities, sectors, organisations, to talk about what we can do in the lead up to COP26 at the moment. That is the next big date on the international calendar when it comes to climate action and when it comes to actually seeing ourselves change what's happening and what has been happening. So we've been at a virtual conference, the Better Futures Forum, yesterday and today. I'm recapping day 2. You can see Ban Ki-moon just up on the screen. We heard from him yesterday. And we've been really looking at today, the second day has been all about these short-term goals and opportunities for long-term gain. We don't just need the long-term goals, we need the short-term ones as well. So I've just recapped the first breakout sessions. The second set of breakout sessions, it was no easier than before to choose which to go to. We had a range of different topics on offer. So tourism and outdoors and stepping up ambition in that sector was one of the topics. Hugely challenging, as you can imagine, to tackle climate issues and emissions reduction in an industry like that. But certainly it was great to see that there are some great examples of organisations and individuals stepping up their ambitions. So we heard from Susan Etty. She is the environmental impact specialist at Intrepid Travel, who are a carbon neutral travel company, which I didn't realise, to be honest. And they're really looking at how to reduce their carbon emissions and even become carbon negative into the future. She was talking about how one of their goals, for instance, is stepping up what they can do to reduce flights and looking at their top 50 tours that they run and that take flights under an hour and a half, and how they can offer alternate ways to travel, for example, buses and trains. And other means of travel. We heard from Mindy Liao, who moderated the session. She's head of community building at B Lab Australia and New Zealand. So she was really talking very passionately about the travel industry and how there's this double-edged sword with tourism and with travel, where we see that people can have huge epiphanies and hugely increase their depth of understanding about different environmental issues. Different environments themselves can become important to people through travel, and that can help in protection. But also on the other side, it is an industry that, of course, has its own emissions and environmental impacts as well. Dom Courtney, who's the EO and President of Outdoor Council of Australia, he spoke, as well as Robert Quirk, who's Executive Director of Park Programs at National Parks and Wildlife. Both Dom and Robert, in different ways, spoke about the importance of access to the outdoors whilst protecting the outdoors. So it was great to hear a lively discussion about stepping up ambition in tourism and outdoors, and how we can see some templates and some practical tips and ways forward and examples from the industry for people who are in that industry and looking for change but not sure where to start. We also had building the resilient, sustainable and equitable cities of the future. Resilient, sustainable and equitable, three big things to aim towards, and definitely no mean feat. So we heard from Michael Lee, who's the Senior Project Manager at Cities for Climate Works Australia. We also heard from Emma Bacon, who's the CEO of Sweltering Cities. Sweltering Cities says it all, really. Thinking about our cities and how they're put together, and how our lives and work and home and the materials that we live amongst and in can make us swelter in a changing climate, but also the opportunities for change in that as well. We talked about the need for getting stronger building codes delivered on the ground. We heard from Evelyn DeLeo, who's the Director of Healthy Urban Environments at UNSW. We talked to Rob McLeod, who's from Sustainable Housing. He's a sustainable housing advocate at Renew, and Anna Crabb, who's the CEO of Australian Energy Foundation. So getting stronger building codes delivered on the ground. Values-based bottom-up planning in cities was another thing that was brought up. Getting homes and small businesses off gas is obviously an immediate action that is needed across the board here, given that fossil gas has become a big part of our discussion in Australia. Unfortunately, it's been framed as if it's the saviour as opposed to one of the villains. But getting homes and small businesses off gas is definitely a huge priority. And having companies with people working from home, which has become a bigger part of the way that we do work over the last couple of years means that we need to improve home energy livability and energy efficiency more so than ever before. So those are all themes that came up in that session. And also it's great to see this overlap. You know, I was talking earlier about a discussion about climate justice and equity. And then when we have this chat about cities, that comes up again when we're talking about housing. So it's great to see there's even in these various different topics, we're seeing overlaps between people and between the sentiment out there. So one of the overall sentiments across the forum has been the reason that we're coming together is for solidarity, but also because we want to collaborate. We want to compare notes. We want to come up with better solutions or find out that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we know each other and can reach out across different sectors and different topics and areas of concern. And we can actually make these plans and implement them. The other side is that there's an overall recognition that our government here in Australia has not been acting on climate, has had overall climate inaction, and worse than that, has gone down the negative path when it comes to climate. I mean, it's negative as in bad. It hasn't been bringing down carbon emissions or methane emissions for that matter. So part of this as well is all of these different people and organisations coming together to say loud and clear, we care and we're acting and we need more guidance and more of a federal government, leadership on this. We need to be having these overarching goals set by our federal government, and so that we're not having to work against, but we're working with the current, I guess. And also letting the international community know that there is a broad sentiment here in Australia amongst individuals and amongst organisations and leaders across the board that we care, and that although our government is often a thorn in the side in international climate talks, that doesn't mean that sentiment is shared across sectors. I've just got a question here from Jan on the Twitch chat. Do we have any examples of good building code that could be used for inspiration? Now, I have to say that I wasn't in that session, but I think if you're looking for good building codes, you should look into these organisations that we saw represented today, like Healthy Urban Environments and Sweltering Cities, because those sorts of organisations are leading the way. There was another campaign that was pointed out to me in one of the other sessions, which was the Healthy Homes campaign, which brings together lots of different organisations who have different parts to play in healthy homes to bring about mandates for landlords to implement energy efficiency measures and other safety measures like seals around doors and insulation and things like that. So when it comes to the actual building codes, I think it's very place-based. The discussion here is in Australia, and so if you're around the world, I guess you could look to international organisations. Like, for instance, I know that there are different international talks on these topics happening. For instance, Climate Works Australia has also a broader international focus. But yeah, so I think that these are great organisations to start with if you are out there and you're thinking about what good building codes and good policy might look like. Sustainable housing, sweltering cities, healthy urban environments, and that was at UNSW. So So check out those organizations. I'm definitely going to be watching back that one. So I've spoken about healthcare workers as part of climate solutions. So we also had from the front lines was the other chat, working with impacted communities on energy transition. And so by impacted communities, we're actually talking about communities that have relied on their economy being underpinned by fossil fuels, by coal mining, for example, and working with impacted communities on energy transition. We heard from Julie Lyford, Chair of Groundswell Gloucester. We heard from Dr. Amanda Cahill from the Next Economy, Wendy Farmer, who's the president of Voices of the Valley in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, Warwick Jordan, who's a coordinator of Hunter Jobs Alliance, as well as Jacqueline McCosker, who's climate and energy campaigner at the Australian Conservation Foundation and is based in Gladstone, where it's the coal capital of Australia. So hearing from these different people about working within their communities, their regional communities that are really impacted by the energy transition, there was an overwhelming sentiment that whether they're mining workers themselves or the broader community impacted by the mining economy and benefiting from that, whether they're farmers, whether they're community people in these regions that broadly benefit from fossil fuels, there's an overwhelming sentiment that they're often talked about and not to. I think that's a problem. There was an overwhelming sentiment amongst everyone that people in these regions don't necessarily trust that the government has their best interests at heart, but they also are sick of hearing, a bunch of us sitting in the cities talking about what they should and shouldn't do without consulting them. So there was a real agreement across the board that when working with communities that are impacted, it's important to be genuine, to ask questions, to listen, to honestly have the best interests of the community at heart, and to want to hear about what they value and what their concerns and fears are. I think there's an overwhelming understanding that energy transition is happening and will happen, and no one wants to be left behind. But also, I don't think everyone is I don't think everyone's confident that they are going to be able to find a way to keep their communities going. So we need to co-design those solutions and also consult. That was a big part of what was spoken about in that session. And better futures for heavy industries was the other breakout session. Then we heard from Tom Quinn, who's head of policy and research at Beyond Zero Emissions, Michael Wheatland, who's a business manager of sustainable processing at Calix, Professor Petra Ashworth, who's director of the Andrew N. Liveris Academy for Innovation and Leadership, and she's the chair of Sustainable Energy Futures at University of Queensland. And Francis Whedon, the founder and CEO of Vulcan Energy, who we also had heard from yesterday when talking about lithium being carbon neutral and coming up with sustainable ways forward when it comes to lithium battery production for the EV future that we're going to be seeing. So in these heavy industries, we're talking about the minerals industry, mining, for instance, fossil fuels, yes, but fossil fuels aren't the only mining industries. Other minerals are and will continue to be part of the picture as far as what industries are out there with jobs and with the need to tackle these issues for themselves as well. So we we talked about how bright minds want to work for companies that align with their values. And so a lot of companies are decarbonising. So yeah, there was an encouragement for education in science and engineering and support for education at universities, and carbon pricing was something that was brought up as a huge need in Australia because that would be useful for a transition when it comes to heavy industries. So far I've only brought us halfway through the day. So this is going to be a 2-hour recap. Before I go into recapping the next half of the Better Futures Forum, I just wanted to, I'll give a shout out to everyone. I can see that there are a few people watching on all of the different platforms. At the moment, I'm streaming to you at Better Futures Australia LinkedIn page. Thank you for joining me there. Thanks for joining me over on Facebook. Hi, I see you there. Hi, everyone on Twitch as well and YouTube. Hi, good to see you. So let's go to another video from our health sector. And this is another Better Futures Australia video, and then I'll be back again.
We coped as a nation very well with the threat of COVID and the pandemic. We listened to the science and took action based on the evidence. And now it's really beholden on us as a nation and as the healthcare sector to do the same when it comes for action on climate change.
We want to lead in this race to have a healthy future. I want the whole community to benefit from this transition so no one is left behind and no one is left out. This is entirely possible in Australia. We just need the imagination and the desire to do this from all sectors of community, including our government.
We've always been clever in the past, so I think there's a key opportunity for Australia to play a lead role in climate. The future should be one in which our children and young people feel optimistic that they can have the same quality of life that we've had.
If we gather together that enormous industry that is healthcare in Australia, it accounts for probably a similar emission contribution to that of the state of South Australia, roughly 7% of total emissions. So that's an enormous window of opportunity where the people who are likely to be treating the adverse impact of climate change, which has already started, as a system can contribute to the solution.
We have set a goal to be net zero by 2045, 5 years earlier than originally expected, and some targets for the next 5 and 10 years. So we hope to reduce our emissions by 39% by 2025 and 60% by 2030. We believe in acting on this. We're showing our responsibility to acting on climate, but also reducing the impact to the Victorian community that we serve.
Health makes up about 10% of GDP in Australia. We're one of the leading sectors in the economy, and we must exercise our leadership now to address climate, the biggest challenge both to our economy but also to our health.
A better future is we recognise and value Indigenous knowledge systems, and nature and health is an absolute priority, that we think about the planet as well as human health.
So a better future for Australia is that we all act to reduce our impact upon the environment and make sure that in doing so we have a just transition for those workers who depend upon that carbon-based footprint.
I think we have this impetus here for change. This is the moment. We need to grab it. We can work together. We can be creative. This isn't about losing jobs. This is actually about creating a new world that's better for all of us.
So there you have it. More visions for better futures. Good to see. Hi again. My name's Lee. It's still me, Lee Constable. I've got one more set of 4 breakout sessions that I just wanted to recap for you to round off the rest of day 2's recap for the Better Futures Forum. So again, we had a set of 4. Let me just share this jam-packed program with you. We had from the top, managing complexity to deliver solutions, raising the natural capital agenda, justice in the courts on the pathway to zero emissions, and talk is cheap. Let's just transition, which I think is a great title. So these 4 sessions again happened simultaneously. Lucky for all of us attending, we're actually able to watch them back if we missed any of them. And I certainly will be watching those that I missed. But lucky for me, in the sessions that I wasn't at, there were some hard at work scribes scribing the other sessions. So I can definitely take advantage of all of these brains that have been lent to me. So managing complexity to deliver solutions. That was a topic brought to us because we need to be thinking about not just the simple case study for what reduction of emissions and climate action looks like, but quite often things aren't that simple. We have variability. We have for instance, your scope 3 emissions. It's just my favorite thing to talk about now, where you've got emissions that are part of your activities, but not necessarily in your control completely. So we heard from Jane Hadjian, who's the CEO of Contexus Australia, Kim Ballestrin, who's the Global Division Manager at Elaborate, that's Elabor number 8, Chris Foley, who's the Head of Energy and Environment at Kmart, and Lisa Rapley, who's the co-founder of Uladara Karulbu, and they were all talking about this complexity and solutions being in the same place. So opportunities on a path to zero emissions that were outlined. Again, we need to get to net zero. We need to get to zero by 2030. So they talked about encouraging B corporations to build to that end, which is certainly something that is being encouraged at this forum. Setting out more precisely complicated and complex spaces for climate. A Synefin framework was brought up. That's Cynefin, Synefin. I hope I'm saying that right. Complicated. So there was the complicated, intricate to do, but certainty when you do it right. And then another part of that framework was complex, so unknown or non-linear pathways. There was also chaotic and obvious. So all of those things make up this framework that can help some people think through the complexity of their emissions. Providing simple climate-friendly solutions for customers when back-end for retail products is something that came up. And I can certainly say that as a customer, I would love that. There are so many different things on our shelves with so many different pros and cons when it comes to sustainability in all its forms, social and environmental and economic, and definitely easing that whole process of decision making for retailers would be great. Part of the solution was also companies ensuring supply chains to take action for scope 3 emissions. So again, it's great to hear this synergy across the board between the different sessions where we're hearing some of the same messages coming through. So we're not seeing, we're already seeing everyone kind of meeting on the same page, even when they're from different sectors. Kmart is committed to 100% renewables by 2025. We're certainly seeing more and more retailers making statements about transitioning to renewables. So that 2025 target is really great. That's on their electricity. Obviously, electricity is not the entire emissions account, but it is a huge and often more easily controlled element of the emissions that a company can look at. So they're also looking at other targets like using 50% less virgin plastic as opposed to recycled plastic, which is great to see. And also they're looking at by next year, no expanded polystyrene. So there are all these things that that customers are demanding or expecting, and also we're beginning to see that these are good news stories for organisations. But of course, we also need to make sure that that goes hand in hand with real action and not greenwashing. So it was great to see a discussion like that happening today. So market forces came up, large companies asking supply chains to take action. That's a big thing because obviously large companies can have negative impacts on the sustainability, environmental or otherwise of their supply chains. So they can also have positive impacts too. The Raising Natural Capital agenda is the session that I attended today. Although I managed to dip in and out of, of the others. We heard from Peter Holding, who's a third-generation wheat, canola and sheep farmer from southeast New South Wales, and incidentally, not far from the sheep farm where I grew up, and my family farms as well. I took the bus to school with Peter Holding's children, so there you go. He's also associated with Farmers for Climate Action. Katie Hammer as well was there from Climate Works Australia. Jennifer West, who's Managing Director of Carbon West, who are a consultancy helping farmers look at their taking advantage of carbon markets, and Kathy Borders, who's the Principal Research Scientist and Leader of Climate Research at UNSW Department of Primary, not UNSW, at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. So natural capital was the topic there, and by natural capital we're talking about the value of things like trees and waterways and looking at biodiversity and also the services that those things bring, for instance, pollination, filtration of water, and the importance of those things. In the context of farming was a big theme throughout the session. Given the panel that we had, it was great to hear overall a discussion about the need for policies, good climate policy. That means we're not just putting a carbon offset band-aid on something that does good in terms of emissions reduction short term, but doesn't necessarily go any way to our long-term goals for emissions reduction, let alone in the ag sector. That was one of the concerns that Peter Holding brought up, which was a good concern to hear about, because we don't just want climate policy, we want effective, impactful, positive policy that does what it said on the box and none of the bad stuff it didn't say on the box. So we're seeing one of the things that was brought up as well is that litigation, sorry, not litigation. One of the things that was brought up as well in this discussion was that we need R&D and collective action to help achieve emissions reduction. We need to state the goal and make it clear to everybody, whether they're farmers or otherwise. It's a massive opportunity. That was something else that was brought up, to set up programs across the country. But rules need to be worked out and signed. And they need to be rigorous. Another thing Peter Holding brought up was we need to be able to distinguish between our geological and biological carbon. No use doing a bunch of carbon offsets for fossil fuel companies buying up land and planting trees and then having those trees, on fire. We talked about the need for management of landscapes to ensure that that there is a path for those landscapes when it comes to improving carbon sequestration, but also improving biodiversity and other natural capital on the land. And yeah, getting the process right was something that came up again and again. Getting the message out to farmers as well, and making sure these carbon accounting systems actually work, and recognizing the multiple approaches to address the problem. The session, the third of 4 sessions, and there's only this one and the next one to go before I really wrap up this recap. We looked at justice in the courts on the pathway to zero emissions. Now, the speakers in this session came from a range of different backgrounds and a range of different definitions of what justice can mean. We had Professor Jackie Peel, who's Director of Melbourne Climate Futures, David Barnden, who's Principal Solicitor at Equity Generation Lawyers, Tim Baxter, who's Senior Researcher at the Climate Council, Adam Beeson, who's General Counsel at Australian Conservation Foundation, and Sister Bridget Arthur, who's Brigading Asylum Seekers Project, who she was a spokesperson for. So all of these different perspectives on justice in the courts, a juicy subject for sure. So opportunities on a path to zero that were brought up. If the state is failing us on climate change and the laws are failing us, then the courts are the only place to act, was one thing that was brought up. Climate change is a relatively novel experience for society, and so courts are one way we can test our societal boundaries and perhaps identify paths forward. Litigation is one thing that was brought up to be used as a way to push for broader and stronger action on climate change by governments, and we've certainly seen examples of that. Suggested ways to work together would be constantly testing the potential for courts to help our society make progress on climate action. And campaigning to establish a Bill of Rights was another thing that was brought up today, as well as the duty of care aspect. That would add a layer of ministerial decision-making relevant for mitigation and adaptation in the face of climate. So some really great ideas for our short-term goals in climate action. And last but certainly not least, the one that I said had a really great title, we had a session called Talk is Cheap, Let's Just Transition. So for this session, we actually saw that a big kind of virtual whiteboard was made to help make notes on this session on the opportunities, challenges, and innovation and collaboration potential. So I'm just going to read from a little bit of that, the Miro board. So this was facilitated by Taylor Hawkins from Foundations for Tomorrow. And the speakers were Holly Crockford, who's the project lead from Foundations for Tomorrow, David Leach, the principal ITK Services Australia and author for New Economy, Stephen Hamilton, the assistant professor in economics from George Washington University, and Karen Kane, CEO of Latrobe Valley Authority. So those speakers were able to kind of talk to this topic of let's just transition. Now, let me just find the Zoom button here because there's a lot on this Miro board, which is good to see. I managed to dip in and out of this session a little bit, but basically some of the main themes that came up were in opportunities were around building on long-term strengths of the communities we seek to work with, talking about how we could make plans for individuals to do personalised ways to help individuals overcome their unique challenges, Tailored and locally developed solutions was another theme. There's a lot of opportunity to fill these gaps when it comes to why we can't and why we things we need to do so we can just transition. Challenges were about individual acceptance, the different nature of the geographical area. So whilst climate change and climate crisis is a global issue, the impacts and the potential solutions are very localized, and there are different social, political, cultural, economic contexts to that as well. So we need a meaningful understanding of what the change is and what's required. And many of the many communities involved haven't had to embrace these sorts of changes in their living memory, potentially depending on where they are. And we need to consider regions that lack other natural industries to lean into. So there was a lot of great collaboration in that session, people putting virtual sticky notes on the board. It was great to see that there are these sessions that allow people to talk and workshop through different things that they're coming up against when it comes to climate action in their own work. So that rounds out a massive day two when it comes to talking about Better Futures Forum. I am stoked to be able to recap that, even for myself, because it's a whirlwind. It's been great to actually do these wrap-up sessions yesterday and today to consolidate a bit of the different learning from all of these virtual sessions with all of these happy faces you see on the screen here. So we heard at the end of the day, again, throughout the day, Dan, who's just showed up on screen there for a second, he was the MC of the forum. So at the end of the day, Dan handed over the mic to Dr. Dowd Batchelor, who is the co-founder of Islamic Thought Legacy and Renewal Group. He was able to give us another kind of reflective ending to the day, to go through an Islamic perspective on the relationship between humans and the environment, and really round out the day with some reflections that we could take away. Just as yesterday we heard from Bishop Philip Huggins from the National Council of Churches, who was able to do the same from a Christian perspective. So it's great to see some faith leaders involved. And just as yesterday we had a musical performance, today we also had a musical performance in the middle of the day, which was really special. And I think we're all feeling like, oh, all these people are performing for us. So it was great to be part of this kind of special event where we got to have a premiere performance. Actually, Nadala Varka, who performed, said that she only wrote the song that she performed last week, and that it was inspired by her feelings around when the IPCC report came out, and that we need to move forward. And the lyrics were really great. So yeah, we were really lucky to hear Nadala perform that as well. So tomorrow I'll be back again. It's day 3 of 3 tomorrow for Better Futures Forum. I will be live tweeting, as I have been the last couple of days. So if you are on Twitter, it's @Constababble and hashtag Better Futures Forum. And you'll see not just me, but a range of different people from different walks of life on there tweeting about what they're experiencing and what they're seeing in the forum. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks so much. I'm sorry that I didn't have time to chat to all of you on the chat. Evo Lozzie, I just saw you coming in to Twitch there. And Lisa, hi. Thanks for watching on YouTube there. I've been streaming into Better Futures Australia LinkedIn. So if you are watching on LinkedIn, make sure you follow Better Futures Australia's LinkedIn page. and they're also on other social media channels, Facebook and Instagram. And you can go to betterfuturesforum.org.au to check out more about how you can get involved and what they're already doing potentially with people in your sector and profession and community. And if they're not doing something with your sector, professional community, get in touch, let them know, say hi. So that is What the Cop Did You Miss Today, and I'll be back tomorrow to let you know what the cop you missed that day. Thanks again, and I'll leave you with one last video, I think. I've really enjoyed seeing the inclusion of local government and mayors and council councils. So we'll go out with one last video, and good night. Have a good one.
As COP26 approaches at the end of this year and the entire planet is focused on saving this one wild and precious life together, it is imperative that the entire Earth commits to net zero emissions by 2050. 120 nations around the world have signed up, and here in Australia, every state and territory has done the same. Better Futures Australia is now committed to getting all sectors of the community together, engaged in this and committed to this very singular collective goal by getting every council in Australia signed on to net zero emissions by 2050.
Local government can have an outsized impact on climate action, and we're the ones who can help make it real for people in the community. That's why we need you. We need local government to lead and to step up and to show that Australians can have an impact and avoid the impacts of climate change.
This is a massive task, and we here at the local government are well placed to deal with lots of the issues. We're in charge of a lot of infrastructure, roads, footpaths, trees, so we can really make a difference.
The more voices that can come in behind climate action, the more we're going to get done. The local government sector is the closest to the community, and we're a huge representation across the nation, and we take it very seriously and doing everything within our power in the driest city, in the driest state, in the driest continent in the world to do what we can to mitigate climate change.
Cities are a really important partner in this race. We can help to turbocharge emission reductions in Australia. But we need to work together, and we need the national government's support.
We've joined the Better Futures Australia group in order to collaborate, to inspire and to advocate for our community to other sectors and to government.
And our community is telling us we need to take action. And so that's exactly what we're doing here in Gawler, and I urge everyone to get on board and be a part of this Better Futures declaration. It is just so important that we all work together.
We have the opportunity to be the renewables powerhouse of the world, as Ross Garnaut says, a superpower of renewable energy. And we have the opportunity to accelerate a just transition between city and country.
We've got the technology, the know-how, the science, we've got the education systems and a lot of the infrastructure in place to be able to make that innovative change and get ahead of the change so that in the future kids can grow up on a planet and be proud of the work that their parents, their grandparents and the decisions they took, ensuring that we have a safe planet that we can all live on.
The good news is that the world is waking up. We're finally seeing more dramatic, accelerated and focused climate action from leaders all around the world. But we're not yet seeing that in Australia. And if we all work together and show that climate action isn't just something that's driven by environmentalists, but it's driven by business, it's driven by the academy, it's driven by local government, by citizens, then we have a greater chance of putting pressure on our leaders who are not stepping up and leading.
So the Better Futures Declaration and Initiative is a fantastic proposal that gets people to work together right across different sectors. So health, agriculture, business, local government, state and federal government, everybody, community members. None of us are excluded from this. We all have a role to play.
The sound of all local governments speaking together is a really powerful voice to send to Canberra.
A big thank you to the cities who've already got on board. The City of Adelaide, Gawler, Mitcham, Moreland, Sydney and Hobart. What we really want is every council to get on board. We all want to work towards this common goal.